I'm going to be very upset if this thing is not going to show my video again tonight. You hear me, Leroy? Okay, good deal. Well, I guess there'll be no video on that. So that's awesome. Now I'm kind of upset about it. Probably going to have to throw a fit. Not sure how, but we'll figure it out. Tonight, we're going to go over something that a couple of weeks ago, I said, I really don't care how people practice their spirituality, as long as it's leading them in a direction that gives them positive purpose guidance, right? I feel that's good. Yes, I probably should. I'm going to. I do want to tackle an issue that sometimes, occasionally we get people, the uninspired and the uninitiated, as I call them. And I call them that for a reason. I've spent close to 20 years now looking at these things and going over these books, going over these ideas. There's some things tonight I'm going to read to you, and I hope it doesn't bore you too much. And if it does, I'm sorry. It's just how it's going to have to be tonight. But there's a deal here that's a comment that I saw earlier this week. This is my take on recent allegorical interpretations of the Old Norse tales. First and foremost, the Old Norse poetic tradition does not utilize allegory, but is built upon substitution to detail certain divine events. The language of poetry has aesthetic functions, which are more lateral in nature, being more paraphrased than metaphor. The language of poetry has a stylistic tradition, is alliterative and meant to be art in spoken form. He's not too terribly off the mark for that. But if we look up what the definition of a paraphrase is, we have kind of a problem, because now we're splitting hairs. It is a use of a longer phrase in place of a possible shorter phrase, right? That is the creation of the poem, right? We're going to use a longer phrase in place of a possible shorter phrase. Okay, so that's a paraphrase. I mean, to change the to define what it is, such as when Sigurd calls in the Ballad of the Victory Bringer, she calls him Tree of Battle, right? Just like a warrior, Tree of Battle. Now, if we look at what allegory means, definition, right? The allegory of the cave. The allegory is a story or poem or picture that can be interpreted to reveal a hidden meaning, typically a moral or political one, a symbol, a literary device or artistic form. An allegory is a narrative or visual representation in which a character, place, or event can be interpreted to represent a meaning with moral or political significance. Authors have used allegory throughout history in all forms of art to illustrate or convey complex ideas and concepts in ways that are comprehensible or striking to its viewers, readers, or listeners. How interesting. So right there, I'm looking at this. There are very few ways to tell somebody that person is, you see someone that's a powerful warrior. Okay, that is a tree of battle. Okay, now I've used an allegory to talk about him as being something more than just a powerful warrior. He is steadfast, stalwart. He will withstand the storm. Now my allegorical comment about him that I have paraphrased gives the reader an indication that he is so much more than a man with a sword, right? The idea that we would not use allegory is, at face value, probably one of the more asinine comments I've ever come across with regards to an understanding of this. The language of the poetry is indicative of several different things. The language of the poetry, the way it's actually structured, allows us to date when these poems were added to the Codex Regius. And I'll stick with the Codex Regius because it is, by default, the foundation for the entirety of what we're going with here. Now, what we also need to bear in mind is that this stylistic tradition, alliterative, is meant to be an art and spoken form. That is from the bard's point of view only. And yet the bard he wants to sway the crowd to perhaps a certain political leaning, or to generate an attitude towards war, or to generate an attitude towards peace, or to reinforce and support a king or a leader or a spiritual individual, or to bring someone familiarity with the great traditions and celebrations as the turning of the seasons and the equinoxes and the solstice. The bard uses the language of the poetry in that stylistic tradition, using allegory, paraphrase, and other aesthetic functions to detail these events, right? So we're kind of in a deal here. But so this first paragraph here does not utilize allegory, is incorrect. Wildly so incorrect, right? The importance of the material contained in the Poetic Edda is needless to dwell at any length. We have inherited the Germanic traditions in our very speech, and the Poetic Edda is the original storehouse of Germanic mythology. It is indeed, in many ways, the greatest literary monument preserved to us out of antiquity of the kindred races, which we call Germanic, right? Moreover, it has a literary value altogether apart from its historical significance. That's a very powerful thing to understand when we're talking about the Poetic and the Prose Edda. It has a literary value altogether apart from its historical significance. The mythological poems include in the Voluspa one of the vast conceptions of the creation and ultimate destruction of the world ever crystallized in literary form. In parts of the Havamal, a collection of wise counsels that can bear comparison to most of the biblical book of Proverbs. One of them is much older than the other, that being the Havamal. In the Lokasana, a comedy nonetheless full of vivid characterization because its humor is often broad, and in the Thrimskvitha, one of the finest ballads in the world, the hero poem gives us in its oldest and most vivid extant form the story of Sigurd, Brunhild, and Atli, the Norse parallel to the German Nibelungland. The Poetic Edda is not only of great interest to the student of antiquity, it is a collection including some of the most remarkable poems which have been preserved to us from the pen, from before the period the pen and the printing press replaced the poet, singer, and the oral tradition. It is above all else the desire to make known the dramatic force, the vivid and often tremendous imagery, and the superb conceptions embodied in these poems, which has called forth the present translation. Right? Now, that's a very powerful body of work. The literary work that we sit here and call the Poetic and the Prose Edda is one of the most important literary traditions that we have. It is full of allegory and paraphrasing and all manner of other things that allow us to see beyond the world that we live in into the realm of the spirit. The second part of this comment is the attempt at retrojecting allegorical interpretation upon the Old Norse narrative tradition has no basis that we can discern from the literature. Obviously, this is an individual that hasn't read the literature or has and has no understanding of what they're reading. This method is primarily fueled by desires to align the literature with a rationalist, materialist, and even foreign world view in certain circumstances. This interpretation mordona par excellence and should be avoided by polytheists. Then what are you going to believe? So on the one hand, you're going to call it sanctified and that we should pay attention to it. And on the other hand, but don't read into it, because that would put us somewhere that would require us to maybe change something about who and what we are. Well, which is it? Which are we going to follow? So are we to believe that as sages and bards and grandmothers and grandfathers sat around fires in the cold of winter to tell these stories, that they were simply told as entertainment, or were they told as bodies of instruction for individuals to think about, to mull over, to become familiar with, so that they can become valuable and contributing members of the society in which they lived. Or perhaps we should chunk out the idea that these stories that contained allegory and paraphrasing and other instruments of literature that governed the all thing, which Snorri was the presiding judge of the all thing. He had to know these so he could stay in tradition and law at the thing as the community expected and understood. Or should we just take it at face value and it's just a story? I find a great deal of incongruity with such an idea. Should be avoided by polytheists. How so? Moreover, allegory within mythology only works when there are personified natural forces and or human qualities situated as characters in a story. Nothing could be further from the truth. This methodology does not fit the Norse narrative tradition, as the gods are multifaceted, distinct, and complex divine beings, not personified natural forces or human qualities. He's got it backwards. See, the reason we can, with disdain, dismiss or dispose of some of these ideas that we so often see as being valuable to the community is because we have put a human idea on it. As we try to rewrite the history with the ugly parts, we do the same thing with our personal being, because if we applied the true understanding that the inspired and the initiated into these mysteries might have told us, it would mean that I need to change something about myself. This is a very complex idea to try to comprehend. But if you look at the very beginning of the Gylfaginning and the Skalparmamal, both men approach in disguise. This individual that wrote this is trying to approach in disguise. One came by the way of the rivers, the crooked rivers. One came by way of the snake. Both men tried to camouflage who they were and what they were seeking, and the gods knew it. Allegory within mythology only works when there are personified natural forces or human qualities situated as characters in a story. What are the gods but beings that know themselves so much more than we do that all things go their way? What is a god but an aspect of each part of us and our thought process? Why else would there be a connection or pantheon of divine beings that represent love and war and fertility and strength and intelligence and the use of song and the harvest? These are parts of who we are, and each one of them moves through our lives as the seasons rotate around the world. They allow us to understand that we're part of the world. The allegory within mythology is an absolutely important part of it, and understanding the human qualities that we may fall short of as these gods set an example of how to step up to the plate and become something more is once again somewhat asinine. It lends itself to the curious proposition that, well, they're there, but we don't really have to follow that because we'll just take it at face value. We can see how the gods were viewed by historical sagas. The historical saga. As the language within them is quite clear and even laconic at times. This is why it is crucial to learn the language in its original form to learn how our ancestors perceived the world. And yet that language shaped the world that we live in and the language we speak now. This approach might be more simplistic or literal, but that is what the material presents to us, and it is not for us to twist into something it is not. It is not for some people to twist into something it is not. There are others who have understanding. There are others who have fought wars. There are others who have suffered greatly, who have found hope and influence and inspiration in these words, as one God sets an example for a man to grab one part of his being and step up to the plate and become something more and survive the situation he's put himself in. To take it at face value and look at it for the rich linguistic, metaphysical, and cultural value, how would we consider it metaphysical if we are told that we cannot we have to learn the language to understand just exactly, it just says just that, and that's what it means, nothing more. I disagree. Vehemently do I disagree. And if some of the elements of what the gods do are unseemly and do not correspond to historical human values, they are gods and we are not. Now, I do believe in that. Our ability to understand how the divine interacts with each other is limited to what our imaginations might create. I would suggest to you that in those moments, an allegory or a paraphrase, some kind of example to inspire us to think of one thing as another and gain influence and understanding of how things should be. These are the stories we have, and we should value and cherish them for what they are and what they can show us about the gods and their works in the world. What word would you use to describe how Odin Bay shaped two pieces of driftwood lumber into the first humans? What word would you use to describe Riggs' visit to the great-grandmother, the grandmother, and the mother? Orgy? I highly doubt. What one word would you use as the dwarves invited Freya into their workshop to create the Brisingamen gem? Gangbang? I highly doubt it. Perhaps a paraphrase would be more appropriate there, as beings like us invite the divine into our realm so that we might become something more. Perhaps a great allegory might be in place to help us understand how to comprehend such things so that we might live better, stronger lives as inspired individuals who are willing to grow into something more, to live up to the strength of our ancestors. How interesting that someone would consider this to be an intelligent oratory and share it, and not less, 89 people decided, oh yeah, he's right. But if that's what floats his boat and it leads him to positive purpose, guidance, and direction, so be it. But I do feel quite strongly that we should understand a little bit more of what we're reading. And there's all kinds of things that need to be understood with this. Let's see here. We don't even know what does the word Edda mean. Various guesses have been made. An early assumption was that the word somehow meant poetics, which fitted Snorri's treatise to a nicety, but which, in addition to the lack of philological evidence to support this interpretation, could by no stretch of scholarly subtlety be the appropriate to the collection of poems. Jacob Grimm ingeniously identified the word with the word Edda used in one of the poems, the Riggs Thula. Surprise, where rather conjecturally it means great-grandmother, the teller of tales. The word exists in this sense nowhere else in Norse literature, and Grimm's suggestion of a tale as of a grandmother, though at one time it found wide acceptance, was grotesquely inappropriate to either the prose or the verse work. Okay. At last, Erikur Magnusson hit on what appears the likeliest solution of the puzzle, that Edda is simply the genitive form of the proper name Adi. Adi was a settlement in the southwest of Iceland, certainly the home of Snorri Sturluson for many years, and traditionally at least also the home of Saemon of the Wise. That Snorri's works should have been called the Book of Adi is altogether reasonable, for such a method of naming books was common. Witness the Book of the Flat Island and other early manuscripts. That Saemon may also have written or compiled another Adi book is perfectly possible, and that tradition should have said he did so is entirely natural. So why would somebody say that Jacob Grimm is grotesquely inappropriate for the what we consider to be the grandmother's tales? So making two powerful arguments, it goes on to say, it is, however, an open question whether or not Saemon had anything to do with making the collection or any part of it, now known as the Poetic Edda, the poetic grandmother's tales. So an individual also here makes a powerful observation that, okay, sounds good, but I think it may be grotesquely inappropriate. So when we look at these tales and we read these interpretations, no matter where they might be from, we need to understand individuals will not want certain aspects of these tales to be understood or interpreted as anything that might mean, oh, I have to change something about myself. No, I would much rather just read it like it is and be a beer drinking Viking and go grand and just be a dick, and I can drink and I can lift and I can be powerful and I can, yeah. Tell me how far that's going to get you in life, in a world that, in a business world in particular, that seems to thrive on ideas such as servant leadership, which I think is largely horseshit, but whatever. Seems to be the way to do it. See, it requires no confrontation. It requires no change. It requires no challenge. And just like those individuals that sought the gods by the way of the snake, by the way of the crooked river, by the way of camouflage and listen to me stutter, and a mask. We have to ask ourselves, when someone tells us something that is something we don't believe in, or challenges our belief, why do I believe that? There's nothing wrong with, as the Christian would say, to be the doubting Thomas. What does this work for? How is this good? Why would this work this way? Does that make sense? Does this person know what they're talking about? When we hear supposed educated scholars say, well, this is really just an aspect of Frigga and blah, 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 an aspect of Frigga, then why is there another name? See, that's the most frustrating thing. And really, it's a curse it's a leftover remnant of scar tissue from a monotheistic upbringing that everybody for the last 1,000 years has undergone. Except for maybe the last 10 or 20 years. There are some children that are growing up now that are raised in polytheistic homes. Well, I say that all of India, much of Japan, Korea still has a very powerful shamanistic culture, Siberia, but here in the Western world, you get what I'm saying. Now, if we go to the foreword, let's go to the verse forms of the Epic poems. No, that's boring as shit. We go to the introduction to the Voluspa. We have a very powerful story here, a very powerful idea, right? The lay of the gods, the Voluspa, the wise woman's prophecy, right? At the beginning of the collection in the Codex Regius stands the Voluspa, the most famous and important, and it is likewise the most debated of all the Epic poems. Another version of it is found in huge miscellaneous compilation of about the year 1300, the Hauksbok, and many stanzas are included in the Prose Edda of Snorri Sturluson. The origin of the stanzas in the Hauksbok version differs materially from that in the Codex Regius, and in the published editions, many experiments have been attempted in further rearrangements. On the whole, however, and allowing for certain interpolations, the order of the stanzas in the Codex Regius seems more logical than any of the wholesale improvements which have been undertaken. The general plan of the Voluspa is fairly clear. Odin, the chief of the gods, always conscious of impending disaster and eager for knowledge, calls on a certain Volva or wise woman, presumably bidding her rise from the grave. Right? She first tells him of the past, of the creation of the world, the beginning of years, the origin of the dwarfs. At this point, there is clearly interpolated catalog of dwarfs' names, stanzas 10 through 16, of the first man and woman, of the world ash Yggdrasil, which is most likely a yew tree and not an ash, and of the first war between the gods and the Vanir, or in the anglicized form, the Vanes. Then in stanzas 27 through 29, as further proof of her wisdom, she discloses some of Odin's own secrets and the details of his search for knowledge. Rewarded by Odin for what she has thus far told, she then turns to the real prophecy, the disclosure of the final destruction of the gods. This battle in which fire and flood overwhelm heaven and earth as the gods fight with their enemies is the great fact in Norse mythology. The phrase described it, Ragnarok, the fate of the gods, and has become familiar by confusion with the word Rocker, meaning twilight, in the German Götterdämmerung. The wise woman tells of the Valkyries, who bring the slain warriors to support Odin and the other gods in the battle, of the slaying of Balder, best and fairest of the gods, through the wiles of Loki, of the enemies of the gods, of the summons to battle on both sides, and of the mighty struggle till Odin is slain and fire leaps high about heaven itself. But this is not all. A new and beautiful world is to rise on the ruins of the old. Balder comes back, and fields unsowed bear ripened fruit. Right? The final passage in particular has caused wide differences of opinion as to the date and character of the poem. That the poet was heathen and not Christian seems almost beyond dispute. And there is an intensity and vividness in almost every stanza, which no archaizing Christian could possibly have achieved. Right? Although they say there are Christian influences. But the fact of the matter is, one is much older than the other, despite the latency in which it was written down on paper, on vellums. Now, I will say that of the Codex Regius originally had 55 pages of vellum. 8 of them are missing. There are no telling what great secrets might be on those 8 missing pages of vellum. What great, wonderful, powerful stories, what absolute secret to knowledge of the universe. It might outclass everything, or it may simply be another contest of knowing how to question and answer well. There are 4 of them in what we have now. 4 separate stories and ideas of being able to question and answer well, and scenes of 2 more throughout the Poetic and the Prose Edda. How much the poem was altered during the 200 years between its composition and its first being committed to writing is a matter of guesswork. But allowing for such obvious interpolations as the catalog of dwarfs, and for lesser occasional errors, it seems quite needless to assume such great changes as many editors do. The poem was certainly not composed to tell a story with which its early hearers were quite familiar. The lack of continuity which baffles modern readers presumably did not trouble them in the least. It was these inspired individuals grew up with it. It is, in effect, a series of gigantic pictures, right? It is only after the reader, with the help of the many notes, has familiarized himself with the names and incidents involved that he can begin to understand the effect which this magnificent poem must have produced on those who not only understood, but believed it. That's an amazing comment there at the end. The magnificent poem, to understand the effect which this magnificent poem must have produced on those who not only understood, but believed it. Should we also not have that? Or should we just read it as a story, as this individual suggests? She's talking about the interpolation of the dwarves, and I'll tell you what that interpolation of the dwarves does. Right? It gives a foothold to this idea that occurred in the 90s that Golveg is Freya. A matter of asinine nonsense is that, but that's how it is. So then from the throng did 3 come forth, from the home of the gods, the mighty and gracious. 2 without fate on the land they found Ask and Embla, empty of might. Soul they had not, since they had not heat nor motion nor goodly hue. Soul gave Odin, sense gave Honir, heat gave Lothar, and goodly hue. What one word could be used for that? Is that not an allegory for these divine gifts that we have received, that we are in possession of to this day? To this day. Then it goes on to describe Yggdrasil in its base. Thence come the maidens mighty in wisdom, 3 from the dwelling down neath the tree. Earth is one named, for Thandi the next. On the wood they scored, and scold the third. Laws they made there, and life allotted to the sons of men, and set the fates. Why would they do that? Why would they originate out of the base of the tree? Mighty in wisdom, 3 from the dwelling down neath the tree. So if Yggdrasil is the world tree, so it is the universe, and Odin is hanging on it at the edge of death itself, Would not the universe do what it needs to do to create something that governs the lives of men? I would submit to you that it would. I would submit to you that the Norns were produced in an effort to help Odin govern the lives of men. It's an interesting thought, and one that that deserves much concern, much thought. Stanza 7, at Ithafal met the mighty god, shrines and temples they timbered high, forges they set, they smithied oared, tongs they wrought, and tools they fashioned. In their dwellings at peace they played at tables, of gold no lack did the gods then know, till thither came up giants made three, huge of might, out of Jotunheim. And then it goes on to the interpolation of the dwarves. Then it comes the creation of man, the origin of the Norns. And then it comes back to stanza 21. So all of those were interrelated. The war, I remember the first in the world when the gods with spears had smitten Golveg, and in the hall of Hor had burned her, 3 times burned and 3 times born, often again, yet ever she lives. Hythe they named her who sought their home, the wide-seeing witch in magic wise. Minds she bewitched that were moved by her magic. To evil women a joy she was. The third one is the Hrothgar. It's in the short Voluspa in Balder's drama. She is the horse thief. So you have the lover of gold, gold might, jealousy, envy, all those things that want gold. I think typically of a Kardashian, right? Hythe, the bewitching of men's minds, and the horse thief. So the 3 all-powerful maidens enter up out of Jotunheim. Then there's an interpolation of the dwarves, the creation of men, and the creation of Norns. Then we come back to those 3 all-powerful female Jotuns that represent the corruption of Asgard. It is not Freya. That is an absolute... Mullenhof maintains that Golveg is not a frame for Freya. But that is an uninspired and uninitiated guess, and probably a fairly uneducated one, too. So you have, right there, you have those corruptive, acidic forces that enter Asgard and become something different. When we look at comments like these, when we look at comments that suggest we should take these stories at face value, instead of trying to understand what they're trying to tell us to become the kinds of men and women that we need to be, I think we are shortchanging ourselves. And as I've said, that little interpolation right there changes the entirety of the dynamic of the understanding of who Freya is, and also how Asgard fell. See, it didn't just all of a sudden, the monsters didn't just jump up and come. There were things coming along working against each other. This is the kind of nonsense that Loki fell up under, right? And that's another thing we need to consider. When Loki goes off to the woods, Odin's figured it all out. He's made sacrifices to gain knowledge and wisdom and understanding. He has Balder for a son, Frigga for a wife. He has these wonderful things. And instead of trying to earn his place among them and be the inspired and the initiated and understand the allegory and the tales and what it means to be a part of something great, he goes off into the wood at the edge of the world with Angerboda and begets monsters, right? He begets the Midgard serpent, Jormungandr, and he creates the Fenris wolf. And the Fenris wolf represents those inner desires of men that tend to cause us to lose aspects of ourselves we truly need to navigate life, that devour those parts of us. Too much drink, too much drug, too much so many other things. It's easy to get too much of a good thing, and then we lose some part of ourselves because we've been feeding this great wolf thinking this is the thing that's going to make life better. This is something that I love and that I care for. Oh, well, I'm going to quit drinking. I'll get back to it. So are we to believe it's just a wolf? We're to believe it's just a snake. Yep, it's going to rise up and destroy the world. The thing that wraps around the world. And even the idea that hell might be a child of Loki is at face value asinine. Even Grimm suggests the further back you go in history, the more prominent she is. Loki's not even mentioned on the continent. There's something to be understood there, too. Something very deep and powerful to be understood there. There are all kinds of ideas that are put forth of this. But you have to understand that if you're not reading it, and I see a lot of people that are doing very well in life and they're following, they wear a hammer, they call themselves good. Okay. And the guess and the hope is always that they find their way to this. But I know individuals who have never read the Poetic and the Prosetta and call themselves heathens. And yet, this is the foundation upon which all of our spirituality stems. That perhaps we might understand the effect, the wondrous effect this tale had upon those people who believed it. And I think that's something we should consider when we look at these things. Have we read it? Do we understand? What does it say in the Havamal about the carving of runes? It's the same type of thing. I read thee, Laud Fafnir, and hear thou my read. Profit thou hast if thou hearest, great thou gain if thou learnest. Huh. That's an interesting set of terms. If thou hearest, if thou learnest. Same thing for the runes. And I will say that these things that he talks about, profit thou hast if thou hearest, and great thy gain if thou learnest, are not, he's not talking about the runes here. Knowest how one shall write, knowest how one shall read, knowest how one shall tent, knowest how one makes trial, knowest how one shall ask, knowest how one shall offer, knowest how one shall send, knowest how one shall sacrifice. This is an interesting and very powerful thing. So this is a regular religious formula concerned less with the runes which one writes and tents than with the prayers which one asks and the sacrifices which one offers and sends. Its origin is wholly uncertain, but it is clearly an interpolation here. If the manuscript, the phrase knowest is abbreviated after the first line. Better no prayer than too big an offering. By thy getting, measure thy gift. Better is none than too big a sacrifice. So Thund of old wrote, ere man's race began, where he rose on high when home he came. What an interesting thing to consider. I heard that passage talked about so many times as something to do with the runes, and yet we have to understand this is a regular religious formula. And there's that terrifying term, a regular religious formula. Oh, holy cow. So there might really be a pattern with which we raise our minds, our thoughts, and our offerings to the gods that might have been governed by, let's say, the Anglo-Saxon priesthood. Huh. See, that kind of stuff, the origin of the Anglo-Saxon priesthood, the Celtic priesthood, the North, all of these, the temple at Uppsala, you know what they did? People don't like it. People don't like the idea. Oh, who are you, the ace of Pope? People hate that kind of stuff. You want to know why? Because it keeps them from putting their foot in their mouth and making gloriously stupid comments like this out loud. Huh. It also put forth the idea that there was a standard by which they lived. There was something that governed the ideas and the way they acted and behaved. It wasn't because they were going to go to hell or heaven. They were all going to the halls of their ancestors, unless they were murderers, breakers of oaths, or the deceivers of men's wives. Then they would be chewed upon by the serpents that dwelt down below with Nidhogg at the roots of Yggdrasil. Pretty simple stuff, especially when there wasn't a cure for syphilis, to deceive a man's wife and curse them all to death of madness. Yeah. So it was a real, when we look at these tales, if we're not reading what's said here and not paying attention and reading these footnotes and learning to understand more of what this means, then we're setting ourselves up for failure. Knowest how one shall write, knowest how one shall read, Knowest how one shall tempt, knowest how one makes trial. Knowest how one shall ask, knowest how one shall offer. Knowest how one shall send, knowest how one shall sacrifice. These are questions to us as members of a community that hold to a certain standard with regards to their spiritual development. It's not all willy-nilly like it is today, where everybody has the right to be wrong and go about and set up and do all these other things and wear their stuff and put on their hammer and go about in the community and call themselves a heathen. And yet they don't know how to write. They don't know how to make trial. They don't know how to ask or offer or send or sacrifice. And then they say, well, these are just stories. We don't need to try to interpret anything into them. How else, given this being the foundational document that provides the bent of the spiritual impetus in our lives, are we to know how to write, read, tempt, trial, ask, offer, send, or sacrifice if these stories are not full of metaphor, paraphrase, and allegory? Quite an interesting thing to consider. So when the educated, yes, it takes a while. Yes, you're absolutely right. I haven't been looking at my comments all the time. I've been trying to put that together properly. But there was a standard of living and a hierarchy which you could move up and down on. That's absolutely right. And the surest way to move down was a demonstration of cowardice. Cowardice, courage, and faith go hand to hand in whatever scenario people might seem to think they need to go in. And the human interpretation on the lore, and to learn to look at it differently, this is the foundation of wisdom. This is the foundation of wisdom with regards to how this spirituality might move forward. So, be that as it may, in 15 minutes or so, I have a Zoom meeting for the members of my GOTHI program. I know the screen was blank, but there was a pretty picture at the beginning of it, so I hope you appreciated that. If the things you heard tonight didn't make you too mad, you want to like and subscribe, go right ahead. There are some other links. I encourage you to sign up for my email. Right now, it's not very daily because, well, there's only so much to write about in a day. And I'm tied up with some nonsense that I got stuck on that hopefully comes out okay. Maybe I'll show it off when I get it done. So, does anyone have any other kind of comments, questions, or concerns? And yes, I do. I absolutely do. And it's a trick too, because sometimes it'll come out with 3 hands and it won't do a woolly mammoth. It'll come out with something that has 2, it'll come out with three trunks and maybe 1 horn turns into a trunk, or it'll have an extra. It's just ridiculous. But yeah, I use the AI for the pics. Some of them are really nice. Some of them have printed up and you can order them, and you're more than welcome to take them and use them if you'd like. I don't really care. Put them on the cover of a book or print them up yourselves, however you want to do it. But anything you want to do to help support all this, I would greatly appreciate it. Yeah. Thanks, Jeremy. I appreciate it. And that's kind of the way it goes. I am going to get off here and get set up for my Patreon meeting. And if you'd like to join the Patreon, you're more than welcome to. There's as much stuff on there as there is on here, and much of it much better. So, having said all that, tomorrow is Monday. And don't forget to grab it by the nose and whip its ass. That is what we call an example. It's an allegory. We're not actually going to grab a dog by the nose and whip its ass. We're going to treat the challenges of life, and we're going to grab them by the ass and grab them by the nose and whip their ass. Perhaps we can understand that. Okay. Do it. Go ahead and use it, man. Use any of it you want. If there's someone you want that you see, let me know and I'll send it to you. I'll send you a big file of it, one that you can print out, 11 by 14 if you need to. So, yeah. Anyway, I appreciate everybody for being here. And I hope I didn't bore too many people, but that kind of stuff that's the real meat and potatoes of what it is we do here. And while some people may not like it, I would submit to you the people that don't like it are the ones that don't want to have to grow into something better than they currently are. Yep, yep. Everybody have a great week. And tell your friends, you found something great and wonderful. And because I am Bryan Wilton, I'm the wellspring from which you flow. I think I kind of heard Shanae vomit a little bit. All right, thank you guys. I appreciate everybody. I'll see those of y'all on the Zoom here in just a minute.